What's the hardest miracle for you to believe in? Every time I read the Gospels and read of the multiplication of bread and fish to feed thousands, that one gets me. Or I guess I should say those stories get me because it happens more than once. I know it says in John that through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. So as the creator of all, Jesus making some extra bread and fish for dinner wasn't a big deal. But how it occurred, what that looked like when it happened, still confounds me. And maybe there are other miracles for you where you think, really? Or perhaps you're new to all of this and you're trying to sort through it, wrap your mind around it. And for me, it always helps to come back to the resurrection. Dead people don't rise from the grave. So if Jesus rose from the grave, it validates everything else he did and said. The only way of explaining it all is to actually believe he was and is who he said. In 1 Corinthians, Paul bases the entire validity of our faith and message on the resurrection, saying if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith. I mention this because in Acts 13, in Paul's sermon in Pisidian Antioch, the focus of the second half of his message was on the resurrection. Now, the resurrection is an article of faith. You can't prove it, you can't disprove it. And here's the thing, though, when you read and truly understand Scripture, our faith in the resurrection becomes reasonable. It will always be a leap of faith, but in light of the evidence, as we investigate, we might conclude it's a greater leap of faith to disbelieve than believe. Let's look at some of the details around the message of resurrection. Picking up in verse 28, Paul speaks of the phony trial and execution. Then in 29, when they carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the cross and they laid him in a tomb. In Luke's gospel, where Acts is Luke's later writing, in Luke's gospel, he adds a few more details, stating that it was Joseph of Arimathea that received Jesus' body. He took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid, meaning it was a new tomb. This is one of those vital details that builds our trust in the resurrection. See, a new tomb was a bit of a rarity in those days, and it made it incredibly difficult for the disciples, even in the midst of their profound grief, to simply show up in the wrong tomb, as some suggest. Like in those days, most people would be buried in their family's tomb. Most tombs would have multiple bodies within, some on shelves at various states of decomposition and decay. Others in ossuary boxes. Jesus' tomb, or Joseph's tomb, which was given to Jesus, had never been used before. It was empty. Now, it would have been a literal dead giveaway to show up at the wrong tomb and to find other bodies but no Jesus. Secondly, as a rich man's tomb, Joseph's would have been incredibly well marked. There's no way a tomb could have simply been lost or mismarked. And the best conclusion we can come to is that the tomb really was empty. Why was it empty? Well, back to Paul's sermon in Acts, because God raised him from the dead. Now, here's the next detail. For many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now witnesses to our people. Jesus, who was executed, appeared living to his followers. They didn't conclude that he miraculously survived the crucifixion and had now recovered. They concluded that he rose from the grave. This is also important. It wasn't just to one individual he appeared to. That could be attributed to a hallucination, but Jesus appeared to many of his followers, spending time with them. In the 1 Corinthians passage I mentioned earlier, Paul states he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, why is Paul saying that? Because he's suggesting, if you don't believe me, go ask them. They'll tell you themselves. Now, here's my encouragement. The resurrection is a historical event, which we can look into and about which we can make reasonable conclusions. But here's the key. Unlike Washington's crossing of the Delaware, another historical event, this one, should we come to a reasonable conclusion that it did occur, it calls us to something. I mean, it should change everything. Because Jesus wasn't just resurrected. By the resurrection, he was demonstrated to be Lord of all. And as such, he requires our all. I hope that encourages and challenges you. Have a blessed week.